The European Union again says it won't reopen the withdrawal agreement it negotiated with Britain. London has been demanding changes to the deal, but the Council President Donald Tusk says that it hadn't proposed a realistic alternative to the existing text.
The European Commission echoed his comments, saying London should provide legally operational solutions.
How you doing? Nice to see you. Hello.
Boris Johnson has set out his demands for renegotiating Britain's exit from the European Union, in a move one EU diplomat dismissed as pure PR. In a letter to European Council President Donald Tusk, Johnson insisted that an insurance policy for the Irish border be removed from the Brexit deal, calling it anti-democratic. The EU has consistently refused to reopen the withdrawal agreement that was agreed by Johnson's predecessor Theresa May last year. But the riddle over what to do with the EU's only land border with the UK has repeatedly imperiled talks. The EU wants to ensure the border does not become a backdoor for goods to enter its single market. But Ireland says a hard border could undermine the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace after 3 decades of conflict. And the UK does not want any virtual border whereby Northern Ireland would be kept more closely aligned with the EU, saying this is inconsistent with the UK's sovereignty. The Irish backstop was a compromise, keeping the United Kingdom in a customs union until a better solution was found. But Brexiteers fear it would leave the UK dependent on rules set in Brussels and hinder efforts to strike trade deals with other countries. Johnson, who meets with France's Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Angela Merkel this week, wrote that the backstop should be replaced with a commitment to put in place alternative arrangements. He also claimed that it is the backstop that could weaken the delicate balance between nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland. That was dismissed by Dublin, with an Irish government source adding that Johnson had given no details over what any alternatives would be. Tusk responded on Twitter, saying that anyone who is against the backstop without proposing any realistic alternatives is supporting the re-establishment of a hard border, even if they do not admit it.
Independent analyst Christopher Gilmor joins us from the Tarbat Peninsula near Tain, Scottish Highlands. Chris, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on The Globe.
Good evening.
Now, talk to us about a theory that Boris Johnson does not really believe the EU will back down because his demands are too excessive and has no intention of compromising.
Lulu, I think you've hit the nail on the head here. The EU is infamous, if I can use that word, for taking these kind of negotiations right down to the wire. They've done it on many occasions in the past, notably with Maastricht back in the 1990s. So I think that's what Boris Johnson is banking on. In other words, he believes that the EU will back down. This is a classic standoff that you've got. So on the one hand, you've got the UK with Boris Johnson and his cohorts in the Conservative Party basically saying that's it. If we get no change to the withdrawal agreement, then we're going to leave on the 31st of October with no deal. And then on the other side, you've got the EU saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it. The withdrawal agreement's not going to change, and especially, as you were saying earlier in the preamble there, the Northern Irish backstop, that isn't going to change. So therefore, you've got this total standoff. And I think Johnson believes that the EU is going to blink before he does. And I'm not so sure that they will.
Now, October 31st is fast approaching. Both the EU and the UK, they don't appear to be headed for some sort of amicable solution to this ongoing stalemate. What are the chances that any one of these two sides can make some sort of compromise? You've just mentioned the fact that Boris Johnson is hoping that the EU will blink and something is going to change.
You see, there are two parts to this whole thing. There's the withdrawal agreement, which is something like 550 pages. And then there's the political declaration, which runs to about 7 pages. And the political declaration relates to what will happen to the relationship between the EU and the UK post-Brexit. Now, that 7-page document, that political declaration, is up for negotiation. No one's arguing about that. However, the withdrawal agreement, the very large, the very thick document, is not going to be negotiated. And I think the EU has made it abundantly clear that even although it will mean extreme hardship for the UK and for Ireland, the Irish and the EU are quite prepared for this because they see the alternative to it as just being completely and utterly unworkable. So you have this situation where neither side is willing to compromise. I mean, Johnson talks about, oh yes, he wants to have a change, he wants to have tweak the withdrawal agreement, and the EU is having none of it. I mean, Theresa May, for all her faults, spent something like two and a half years with her advisors working out this withdrawal agreement. And it's, as I said a few moments ago, it's an extremely complicated document. So to go in and change that in any meaningful form, I think really is something of a pipe dream. So that's why I say I think all of this is bluff, double bluff. And the other thing we have to bear in mind as well is that the EU members, and especially Emmanuel Macron in France, many of them are getting heartily sick and tired of the way that Britain has been handling this thing over the past 3 years. And many of them, even although they realise that a no-deal Brexit would be very harmful for both sides, both for the EU and for the UK, are quite prepared for it, just to get rid of this troublesome Britain.
Now, you've got voices emerging from the Labour Party saying that party leader Jeremy Corbyn cannot stay neutral on Brexit and must pick a side if a second referendum is to be held. Is this perhaps a sign that rumblings within the Labour Party could lead to some hemorrhaging?
Yeah, it's interesting because Jeremy Corbyn apparently voted in the original referendum in 2016 to remain. Well, that's what he said. And yet his actions suggest that he's no real fan of the EU. And he's only reluctantly now coming to the party and talking about, yes, perhaps we should have, the UK should have a second referendum. So, you know, I don't know if what he says and his actions are really aligned. I think what he's starting to realise, though, is the real politic of what is going on the ground there. I think on the ground, in terms of what is going on amongst the general population, people, A, are heartily sick and tired of this whole Brexit situation, but B, I think the momentum has moved away from the Leave campaign and more to Remain. I think if the referendum were held today, if it were re-held, I think you would probably see, albeit a small win for Remain rather than Leave. But it's a bitterly divisive thing, and Jeremy Corbyn realises that backing Remain is a very, very serious and a very difficult option. As I say, on the one hand, it's seductive, it sounds a little bit compelling, but on the other hand, you know, he might just get it wrong. So he's got to weigh all of these factors into consideration, and I'm not so sure that he's going to be the person at the vanguard of trying to get a second referendum. I think if something like that occurs, it's more likely to be Joe Swinson in the Liberal Democratic Party rather than Jeremy Corbyn with the Labour Party.
Now, the British government, Chris, on Monday said it will end European Union freedom of movement rules immediately in the event of a no-deal Brexit, which is on October the 31st. What would the medium to long-term consequences be, and how is the broader EU likely to respond?
Yes, that was quite a strong statement. That would be taken very badly indeed. And I think there's no doubt about it, you'd see a kind of retaliation in the EU. Look, I know certain people who are already living in the EU and have been told quite categorically that if and when Brexit occurs, then they're going to have to reapply for their permanent resident status, or their resident status for that matter. So yes, if this happens, and I think the UK has made it clear that probably will happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit, then you're going to see a similar situation happening to UK citizens in the EU. And that's really to nobody's advantage at all, especially if you think about the number of, let's say, for example, the number of health professionals who are currently working in the UK. If they're not allowed to stay there, you're going to get rid of free movement of these health professionals. And we're talking doctors, nurses, paramedics, this type of thing. that's going to really put a big spanner in the works in much of the health system in the UK. So this is going to cause all sorts of major problems. But I come back to my original thesis, which is that I think an awful lot of this is bluff and double bluff. And we'll only know if what they're saying is accurate, unfortunately, if it really goes down to the wire.
Now, Chris, as the UK races towards a potential no-deal Brexit, we see US President Donald Trump, cheering it on. Is there any likelihood that he will come to the party and rescue the United Kingdom from a potential economic catastrophe?
Sorry, could you just repeat that bit? I missed the last part of that.
I was just touching on US President Donald Trump and how he could potentially, come to the rescue of the United Kingdom from a potential economic catastrophe, as he has been cheering the no-deal Brexit.
Yeah, I think we must be very careful of Donald Trump bearing gifts, so to speak, to use that metaphor. I think he's made it clear on a couple of occasions when he was across recently attending the state visit. He laid down all sorts of conditions for trade deals. So if we're talking about coming to the rescue in the form of trade deals between the US and the UK, first of all, they would take a long time to establish. And secondly, I think they'd be very one-sided in terms of being very favourable to America and not so much to the UK. So, for example, one of the things he was talking about is in the event of establishing a trade deal, he would like to see the national health system, the NHS, being privatised. And I don't think anyone in his right mind is going to sit back in any political party and accept that. So I think that's a kind of non-starter. Other things that I've heard of is that would be that the City of London, the financial hub of the UK, would have to give up massive chunks of their current US dollar clearing facility to the US. So in other words, what I'm saying is, I think if we're talking about Trump coming to the aid of the UK, it would come with all sorts of conditionalities that I think, frankly, would be very unpalatable to the great majority of British citizens.
Now, a majority in Parliament opposes leaving the EU with no deal. Can British lawmakers stop Johnson?
They can. And that is why Johnson has kind of suggested that if Parliament does in fact try to defeat his proposals, then he may go down the road of what's called prorogation, proroguing Parliament. In other words, suspending Parliament, going to the monarch, going to the Queen, and asking for example, a 3-month suspension to allow his regulations to go through, unhindered by Parliament. And again, that is completely unprecedented in the UK, and would be treated as being incredibly anti-democratic. And I think that would harm the Conservative Party's chances of getting back into power post an election. And I'm perhaps preempting your next question. I think the chances of a general election now, with the majority that the Conservatives have got in Parliament being so thin, they're down to a majority of 1. In that instance, I think the chances of them losing a vote of no confidence, coming back to what Jeremy Corbyn might do, are actually quite high. So, there are an awful lot of things that can happen between now and the next 70-odd days, between now and the end of October.
Now, Chris, last Prime Minister Theresa May spent some time trying and failing to deliver Brexit. Why should anyone think Prime Minister Boris Johnson isn't headed for a similar fate?
No, I agree with you entirely. I think that's why I say a lot of it is bluff and bluster. Look, he's kind of charismatic in a strange sort of way, if you like that kind of thing. So I think he's relying on a lot of that. I mean, Theresa May had virtually no charisma at all, if I might put it that way, whereas this fellow is, albeit a bit of a buffoon, he appears to have a bit of charisma. And I think he reckons that charisma is going to be able to carry him. Well, I'm not so sure that it is. So, only time will tell. And Parliament, as you rightly say, defeated Theresa May's legislation, or proposed legislation, 3 times, once by the most... once by the largest majority in UK parliamentary history. So I would agree with you. I think the chances of Johnson getting this legislation through Parliament are extremely slim. And with what I said earlier, I think the mood is now changing in the UK. So parliamentarians have to be aware of that. So if they're voting for something which is becoming increasingly unpopular, then they would have to look out in terms of the next general election. And that's why I think is the key part of this. There will probably be a general election, maybe even before the year is out. So many of these parliamentarians must be looking over their shoulders thinking, will I have a job in a few months' time?
Chris, always a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us. That's independent analyst Christopher Gilmor joining us from the Tarbat Peninsula near Tain, Scottish Highlands.